I am the chair of the Climate Change and Ecology Policy and Accountability Committee. Before we begin, there's just some housekeeping notes to cover. Let's see. The meeting is being live streamed on YouTube. By taking part, you are consenting to being recorded. Please can officers introduce themselves before speaking for the first time, and would everyone please use their microphones, the person button. There is tea and coffee and biscuits available in the staff kitchen next to reception, and the toilets are on my left-hand side. You won't need security badge to get in the kitchen. The kitchen's open, I believe. Okay, if the fire alarm sounds either continuously or intermittently, I will adjourn the meeting. Please leave the meeting in an orderly fashion by the staff exit, which is behind me to my right. Officers will direct you to the assembly point in Riverside Gardens. Okay, let's proceed to the agenda. Apologies for absence. We don't have any apologies, so Councillor James must be running a little bit late. Declarations of interest. As the chair, I would like to declare a non-pecuniary interest in item 5, flood risk and adapting to climate change, as my basement kitchen was flooded in July 2021. Going forward, the minutes of the last meeting. Do members agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of November? Very good. Agreed. And let's move on to the budget, the medium-term financial strategy. Councillor Rowan Reid, would you like to introduce?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm aware that we've got a number of people here for the following items, so I'll try and keep this brief. Obviously, these are very difficult times to be trying to put together a budget in local government. Despite this, we've managed to put together a balanced budget that not only protects the services that we know residents value and rely on, but also invests in new services as well, £10.7 million of additional investment. Now, that's only been possible because of the ruthlessly financially efficient approach we take to managing budgets here in Hammersmith and Fulham, and the continuous process of reform that we're constantly going through. Now, I'll touch on all these things briefly in a moment, but before, I'd just like to start by thanking a few people. I want to thank James and the finance team, who've done an excellent job in helping to put this budget together this year. I want to thank cabinet colleagues like Wesley and the officers within the various departments, like Kelly and Bram, who've done remarkable work in terms of managing spending so efficiently over the past year and still finding savings 14 years into austerity. This is a difficult time to be working in local government finance. Anyone who's opened a newspaper or turned on the radio will have seen some of the horror stories from around the country, whether it's places like Woking, Birmingham or Nottingham. They're issuing Section 114 notices, essentially saying that they're unable to meet their financial obligations. 1 in 5 councils this year say that they expect to issue a Section 114 notice. So that really does show you the dire state of local government finance at the moment, and the significant lack of investment that we've seen over recent years. But I wanted to start by reassuring any residents who are watching this, any residents who come to you as members of the committee, who are concerned about the services that they rely on from the council. Hammersmith and Fulham Council is in a good situation financially. Last year, we managed to run a budget surplus. We underspent against our budgets. And at a time when most people are taking money out of their reserves, we actually put additional funds in. We started this budget setting process with a budget gap of £25 million. That means before spending a single extra penny on new services, we had to find £25 million worth of savings. And that shows the scale of the challenge that we're facing year on year. And that's in conjunction with the fact that since 2010, we've seen a reduction in our grant from government of 56% in real terms. But despite this, we have managed to put together a balanced budget this year. We've managed to protect the services that residents rely on, that residents value, and also those extra services that make Hammersmith and Fulham unique, those things that they don't do anywhere else, things like free home care, things like free breakfast for primary school children, things like our local law enforcement team. Now, that's only been possible because of the ruthlessly financially efficient approach that we take to managing budgets. And as I say, through our continuous process of public service reform. I often think that the second part of my job title, the reform element, is just as important as the first. Now, there are three different reforms I'd like to just touch on this evening. Firstly, technological reform. I think in Hammersmith and Fulham, we really are at the forefront of embracing technology in local government. We're using artificial intelligence in our adult social care service. We're using robotics and automated processing as part of our revenue and benefits team. Now, that just makes sure that all our services are as efficient as they possibly can be, and they are delivering the services that residents need as effectively as possible. Secondly, organisational reform. So there are four big council-wide reforms as part of this budget. We're taking a cross-service look at how we use property as a council, the commercialisation, whether there's any opportunities for us to be making additional income, the staffing across the council, and finally, our use of data and how we manage this and avoid silos as a way of working. Finally, policy reform. So as part of this budget, we are funding initiatives like family hubs. Now, this is a great way to take services out of the town hall and into the communities where people actually use them. So this is a way to make the council more accessible, make our services more accessible and more effective for residents. I'm going to hand over now to James, who's going to talk through the budget setting process. And then I think we're going to hear a little bit more detail about the Environment Department in particular. Thank you very much.
James Newman, Assistant Director of Finance here at London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. Just going to talk you through a sort of at a corporate level, the budget for 24-25 and our approach. I'll start by outlining our strategic operating environment, so the kind of the wider context of kind of what we're operating within. The objectives of our financial plans and delivery strategy, the proposed budget for 24-25 and how that was built, and the medium-term forward look. So the strategic operating environment will be pretty familiar to most, I think. There continues to be significant economic turbulence in terms of higher inflation and interest rates as a result initially of the war in Ukraine. And the Bank of England base rate, as we know, is now at around about 5.25%, having been at record lows for an incredibly long time. There also is obviously pressures on household budgets as a result, and we've seen unemployment and a fall in real incomes. We've seen new legislative burdens, such as the Environment Act and the Social Regulation Act. And we've also seen within the sector increasing regulation, notably Oflog, the CQC, which inspects things like our social care provision, and the Housing Ombudsman, which has been looking at our housing stock and the condition of that. There is also great uncertainty within local government funding, notably around the Fair Funding Review, which was due to come in 2014, which looked fundamentally at how local government funding is allocated, which never arrived. And we continue to wait for that. I think that 24-25 is also the 6th year in a row of one-year settlements, which means that local government is really on a 12-month hamster wheel and doesn't really have any kind of ability to kind of plan beyond that one-year window, which makes things very difficult. And there is also things like social care reform, which has been sort of delayed as well. So there are a number of things that we're waiting for that haven't quite arrived yet. Locally, we also have a number of major regeneration projects in the borough that need to be completed, notably Civic Campus, Hammersmith Bridge, and our various housing developments such as Hartop and Lannoy. There are a number of objectives that we have against that we work with when we are putting together our financial plans, notably fundamentally protecting our statutory services. So really, looking after vulnerable people. That really, things like our demand-led pressures, and I'll come on to that in a second. Delivering services that are valued by residents, businesses, and visitors, and the councillor has talked about things such as the LET team, which are very much valued by residents. Ensuring the safety of our residents, businesses, and visitors. Promoting prosperity of the borough. Being an agile, modern, and innovative council. So again, Councillor Reid talked about the AI and kind of using technology to actually make us become more efficient. And also maintaining strong financial governance and resilience. So as we all know, the Section 151 officer, the Director of Finance, needs to sign off a balanced budget as a legal requirement each year. And that is obviously a fundamental requirement. So in terms of our strategy to deliver our financial plans, We've delivered efficiencies of 118 million since 2014-15 through either savings generation or increasing income. In addition to our general fund budget, we have generated SIL Section 106 resources with a balance of over 100 million at the moment. So that actually helps us to kind of support both our revenue and capital expenditure. We recovered service delivery costs from fees and charges where we recover the cost of delivering that function to the tune of around about 60 million. We secure resources through national programmes. We work collaboratively across the public sector, so with partners such as the NHS. We use considerably modern IT systems to actually provide service delivery. And again, just as I've mentioned, we maximise use of new technologies such as AI and analytics with a sizable business intelligence team within the organisation. So in terms of the budget build and our proposed strategy for 24-25, which forms the budget report, within there are key principles. Inflation is something that we've talked about already, and within the budget strategy for 24-25, pay was accounted for at 3% and price inflation at 5%. So this reflects kind of higher inflation levels than we've seen previously. There is major investment for the delivery of council priorities, and I'll come on to that in a second in terms of where that's actually been covered. There is a council tax proposed increase of 2.99% plus the flexibility of using the adult social care precept of 2%, meaning an aggregate increase in council tax of 4.99%. We had the National Revenue Grant Settlement on the 18th of December as part of the Local Government Finance Settlement, so that's central government funding to us. We've anticipated growth in our council tax base in terms of number of properties that we actually have within the borough. Again, that drives income. We've maintained resilience within the budget by retaining contingencies that we hold in the budget for unforeseen circumstances. And we've also ensured that we've got enough revenue budget to fund the capital programme, so the cost of capital that is within revenue. In terms of council tax considerations, you will know that we have one of the lowest nationally, with a bandy equivalent of £871 in 23-24, meaning a 1% change is estimated at around about £8.70 per annum per household. We have 93,000 dwellings in the borough, of which 4% are exempt from council tax. A further 11% will be fully protected through the council tax support scheme. A further just over a quarter will receive the single person discount of 25%, leaving around about 58% that will be expected to pay the council tax bill in full. National government has also indicated that there will be a flexibility to increase council tax by 5% each year until 27-28, including the adult social care precept. Although we take the decision to do that, the flexibility on an annual basis depends on the budget position. It's also worth noting that where we are increasing our council tax for 24-25, I think pretty much every other London borough is doing so as well. So in terms of a summary of our proposed revenue budget for 24-25, obviously we balanced 23-24. In terms of changes for 24-25, we put in pay and price inflation at 3% and 5% of 13.7 million. There's been investment in services, growth in the budget of 10.7 million, and I'll go on in a minute to explain where that has been targeted. There are efficiencies and savings of 8.1 million. And then there have been other reductions in the budget covering things like interest on balances, so additional investment income, and also a reduction in our concessionary fares charge, which just reflects usage data. So these things have actually meant that there have been reductions in the budget requirement of 12.3 million. And then the 4.99% council tax increase, including the adult social care precept, drives at £4 million increase. And that gets us to a balanced budget. In terms of the 8.1 million of savings, that's really the breakdown there. So what you'll see there is a combination of savings across all of our services, notably within adult social care, 2.1 million, children's services, environment services, economy and finance. So all directorates, all services contribute to it. And that's why it is absolutely a team effort, and it's a corporate effort as well. So we're already beginning to look at 25-26, sort of now to start kind of working up targets, working up plans, putting that timetable together to consult with cabinet members, etc., etc. So it is an ongoing process. And as I've mentioned, there's 10.7 million of growth allocations. So home care was obviously a major service within the borough, and we've actually increased home care budget by 4.2 million. And there are also budget increases for a number of other demand-led pressures, notably the transitioning of children to adult social care services, temporary accommodation in the borough, children's school transport, HRA general fund mechanism. We've actually rebalanced that. So the general fund charge to housing is 1.7 million less. Family hubs and other smaller growth allocations. Reserves is obviously an important part of our balance sheet, and reserves are there for really for timing purposes where we know we're going to need money in the future, also for unforeseen circumstances. And it's fair to say that our reserves cover is adequate. It is adequate in current times and comparable to London authorities. We estimate our general fund reserves to a forecast to reduce to about 92 million by 27-28. So we will continue to have a relatively good level of reserves over the medium term based on our current forecasts. Within that, we hold a recommended minimum general balance of 21 million, which is within the tolerable amount of 19 to 23 million. We're not actually applying any general reserves against our budget for 24-25 either. So whereas some boroughs will be using general reserves to actually balance the budget, we're not doing that. We are only using, in a very small amount, targeted earmark reserves for things such as IT upgrades. So there are no general reserve. There is no general reserve usage for 24-25. In terms of the medium-term forward look, we continue to operate within a difficult environment. So obviously, inflation and interest rates remain difficult to predict, and that will be a major consideration for looking at 25, 26 and beyond as we actually refresh the medium-term financial strategy. There remains that increasing level of national regulation and inspections, which drives cost and scrutiny. There are continuing local demographic pressures across the key four demand-led pressures, namely adult social care, children's social care, SEND transport, and temporary accommodation, which is starting to spike for us. I think we've seen that we've seen major overspend in other boroughs, upwards of 20 million in places like Enfield, and we're not seeing increases of that magnitude, but we are starting to see an increase, and that's something that we are monitoring closely. We've got an average forecast budget gap stated here of around 12 million per annum, but I expect that to increase when we've actually finished rerunning the numbers for 24-25. So I think that figure will definitely increase further, and that will drive the savings requirement for 24-25. So next steps, we had the Policy and Oversight Board last Monday. The PAC committees obviously this week and last week. And that means we then go on to Cabinet on the 12th of February with full Budget Council on the 28th of February. And that ends the slide deck. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to go on to Bram.
Chair, we're just waiting for the slides to load up.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Bram Kant. I'm the Strategic Director of Environment, and I'm going to give you some highlights of the Environment Department's budget, especially highlighting the things that impact on this committee. Thanks. Next slide. This is a colourful slide. It gives you a sense of all the activities that take place in the Environment Department, the amount of transactions, the scale of the operation. And I always think it's useful to remind us of all the activities that take place and how much work that happens within the Environment Department. Okay, next slide. This slide just highlights some of the achievements that are relevant to this committee. Starting off with, we got launched the largest ever local authority green community investment scheme with a £5 million target. That's cheaper borrowing from more traditional means and maximises the opportunity for community engagement and support for Hammersmith and Fulham green aims. We're also minimising waste and increasing recycling, rolling out of food waste collections to 50,000 street-based households, wheels bins for properties with sufficient space. We've got the highest concentration of electric vehicle charging points in the UK and the largest concentration of air quality monitors in Europe. We're recognised by UK Divest as amongst the most successful local authority pension funds in divesting from fossil fuels. We're also promoting active travel, creating a legacy of cycle-trained young people, delivering bikeability for families and green local deliveries through Parcels Not Pollution's Cargo Bite scheme. We're also recognised as leaders in environmental action, A rating from Carbon Disclosure Project for transparent and bold climate action and commitment. Next slide. This slide basically summarises what the Environment Department's budget is made up of. There's about 50 or so budget managers looking after about 80 plus services within the Environment Department and managing a revenue day-to-day budget of £109 million with an income of £80 million. And that's across 3 service directorates as indicated in the table below. So in total, we're spending £109.2 million expenditure, and we've got £80.4 million worth of income, giving a net budget position of £28.8 million. In terms of implications relevant to this PAC, the Climate Change and Ecological Team budget sits within the Environment Department. There's no proposed changes to this budget for 24-25, aside from inflationary uplifts. The role of the team is to influence spending across the wider council to ensure that spending is aligned with the council's climate and ecological aims. You've heard about how much opportunity there is if you look at the spend across the whole council. The team is focusing also in securing external funding in order to maximise climate action at least cost to the council. Next slide. In terms of strategic budget issues, obviously the one at the top of the list is significant funding requirements for addressing climate and ecological emergency. We've got Hammersmith Bridge work undertaken at risk pending confirmation of funding from DFT and TfL. We've got waste disposal savings from new waste collection services may be insufficient to cover service cost. And we also got significant national inflationary pressures impacting on service spend, e.g. energy and fuel and current service contracts. We've also got potential national public finance pressures impacting on specific grant funded services, funding that we get from TfL. And we also got continuous pressure on income with a target of £80 million income target. You can imagine that a lot of this income could be quite volatile. And then lastly, we've got ongoing pressure and challenges to secure funding for the corporate business plan objectives. I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Would anybody like to ask any questions of what we've heard so far? Councillor Melton.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd first like to thank Councillor Reid, James and Bram for such a comprehensive report, and particularly Bram for his name check and complimentary mention of the divested pension fund, which he knows is an issue very close to my heart. I'd also like to compliment the team on the local authority green investment scheme and ask if they could provide a short detail on the timeline for the scheme and the planned projects to be funded.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to pick that up. So the Hammersmith and Fulham Green Investment Scheme is the largest ever green investment scheme of its kind. We're looking to raise up to £5 million in order to fund climate change projects across the borough. The first tranche of the investment has gone out. That went out in November, looking to raise up to £1 million. The closing date for that first tranche is the 13th of February, which I believe is next week. We're really proud of this scheme. It's been tried in other boroughs before, but never quite on this scale. So this is 5 times larger than anything else that's been done elsewhere. We really think of it as a win-win-win. It's a win for residents who choose to invest in this. They can get a long-term, low-risk investment of 4.85%. It's a win for the council because, as we've heard, it allows us to borrow at a slightly more competitive rate than we would otherwise be able to borrow for these projects. And most importantly of all, it's a win for the environment because it helps us to put in place measures to both combat and to mitigate climate change here in Hammersmith and Fulham. In terms of what the money will be spent on, we're looking at a range of issues. Firstly, renewable energy, so potentially putting up solar panels. things like that across the borough. We're looking at climate change mitigation measures, perhaps flood defences, and then measures to promote active transport. So we've already seen a number of bicycle hangars planned to be put up across the borough. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up? No, you okay?
Just thank you for such a comprehensive response.
Can I jump in and ask about grants? How many grants per year do we compete in, and how successful are we in winning grants, and how often are we planning to apply for grants this year, particularly for climate change?
Thank you very much, Chair. The short answer to that is we try and apply for every single grant that is available, subject to resources being available, etc., to actually apply for the grant. So we're quite keen. We're always on the lookout for any grant applications. Most of the grant applications come with quite strict sort of rules in terms of how you spend it and what you know, whether there's match funding or not. So there is a continuous process of going through that all the time. We can get better at it by actually doing more feasibility work at risk, etc. So when we got more large capital projects, we could probably do more work in order to prepare for that. But generally speaking, we take every opportunity. I'm always on the lookout for any opportunities where we can actually apply for money, because that's what we need. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I should have actually said thank you, Councillor Ree, Kelly and James and Bram. Everybody's been fantastic. Do we have any questions? Councillor Fonse.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Ree and officers, for your reports. Very informative. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, paragraph 24 regarding the review of parking services and the use of ANPR tech. Given this review, may I ask how much of the budget revenue is from clean air neighbourhood fines?
Yeah, I'll pick that up. So parking revenue isn't something that you can raise for general funds. You know, all money raised from parking revenue goes back into the service, and so it doesn't really feature in terms of our budget planning.
Would it be possible to get the figures?
Any income from parking is ring fenced. It can only be used for matters like highways and environmental issues. It cannot be used as part of the general fund, so that's why it's not included.
But could we get a figure?
Yeah, just to say the parking account figures are actually released annually, and that's how we normally release all the figures, because they have to be audited and vetted, etc., as part of that process. So when they're released, I can forward them to you. So thanks. Including the specific can fine figure. Yeah, it will include what the figures that it normally includes. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question. Paragraph 45 states that the borough has the biggest concentration of air quality monitors in Europe. Why then has no air quality data from these monitors been put on any literature regarding the clean air neighbourhood, including any of the readings from them?
Thank you very much for that. Air quality monitoring, first of all, is quite a complex process, but there is an upcoming cabinet report on South Fulham that will present some air quality data in that, which will come from these air quality monitoring stations.
Well, thank you. It's just disappointing that it's taken so long. And a final question. So in the cabinet report, which is far more extensive on the environment side, page 189, it says the slippage this quarter mostly relates to a temporary pause of the Clean Air Neighbourhood programme, and that a meeting for the end of November will settle the future of this scheme. Given nothing has been budgeted past 24-25, are you in reality about to abandon this scheme?
Sorry, when you say the cabinet report, could you let me know which one you're referring to?
So page 189 of the cabinet paper for the meeting on the 12th. Specifically the section on environment.
That's the appendix, you mean? Well, I can give you a very simple answer to your question. No, we're not planning to amend it, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, so May I ask then what the 2.847 million budgeted for the 24-25 will actually be spent on?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. As part of the clean air neighbourhood in South Fulham, especially on the east side, there is a lot of greening measures and sustainable urban drainage measures and trees being implanted. Hence, that's where the money would actually go.
Thank you, councillor. Any further questions?
Just to say
fine.
thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's an open forum, so I can ask the residents who've kindly come tonight, if anyone wants to ask a question on the budget, you are welcome to come forward. But I don't see any hands, so I think we are going to move that we consider the budget proposals, and we make recommendations to the cabinet to approve. Thank you. And the proposed changes to fees and charges and makes the recommendations as appropriate. Thank you. Agreed. Thank you. Right, moving on to item 5. Yeah, thank you. We're just going to take a 2-minute break. Okay, thank you. So flood risk and adapting to climate change. First of all, can I welcome Thames Water? We've got Michael Benk, thank you, and Graham Castleman coming from Thames Water, so thank you for coming. So I'm going to hand over to Jim Cunningham to present. Thank you.
This one. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Jim Cunningham. I'm the Climate Policy and Strategy Lead in the Council's climate team. First of all, myself and our consultants at Atkins Vialis are going to present a little bit on our climate risk assessment and adaptation strategy, which is underway at the moment, and I'll explain a bit more about that in just a second. And then we'll hand over to our highways team to talk a bit about local flood risk, and then to Thames Water as well, to continue on that topic. Just for this first of the three presentations, we'll give you a bit of introduction and context. I'll do that in just a second, and then I'll hand over to Francis Hyle and Cara O'Keefe from Atkins Vialis to talk through some of our preliminary findings from our climate risk assessment. So you might be wondering, what is a climate risk assessment? So we know that climate change is already having impacts globally, which we've been seeing increasingly in the news, but also locally as well. Most notably, I think the July 2021 floods that you alluded to, Chair, and also the extreme heat wave in 2022, which saw the UK's temperatures hitting 40 degrees for the first time. And we're seeing impacts of those on the services that we provide as a borough, having to change how we operate in extreme temperatures, for instance. Also seeing impacts to our infrastructure, having to cool Hammersmith Bridge round the clock. And of course, over 600 properties are known to have flooded in those July 2021 floods. So as a council, we're implementing actions to try to mitigate some of these risks, including installing sustainable drainage, greening measures around the place, and adopting policies into our local planning policy to ensure new developments help to mitigate flood risk, heat risk, also drought as well. But we know that a lot more needs to be done. So the climate risk assessment is to help to give us a better understanding of the risks that we're facing as a borough. So what are those key risks? Who is most at risk? Which pieces of our infrastructure are particularly vulnerable? And this is a two-part piece of work. So we've initially been working on the climate risk assessment side. That will then be followed by an adaptation strategy. So looking at which kinds of actions do we most need to prioritise, what would be the costs of failing to adapt to climate change, and how can we do it in the most kind of effective and cost-effective way. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Francis and Cara.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, councillors, for the opportunity to present tonight. So I'm Francis Hyle. I'm an Associate Director in Climate Change and Resilience with Atkins Vialis, and I'm an expert advisor to the London Climate Change Partnership, and currently advising on the London Climate Resilience Review. And this is Cara, my colleague. Hi, everyone. I'm Cara O'Keefe, Climate Change Consultant at Atkins Vialis, also working with Oxfordshire County Council and specialising in climate risk assessment. Great. So we will go to the next slide, please. Oh, Jim just mentioned this, but I'll just give a brief overview of the two stages of the project that we're being commissioned to support Hammersmith and Fulham. I'm not sure if you can hear when I speak over there. So the first piece is the climate risk assessment, which we are well underway with. We started the work at the end of October and started with a workshop of stakeholders within the council to understand the council's view of where key issues have been in the past, receive inputs from the council on some of the data and information that can be provided so that we can build up the evidence base around the impacts that climate change is already having in the council, and also looking at the impacts that could get worse over time. We've then used our models and tools to come up with climate change projections. We've used climate change projections from the UK climate change projections developed by the Met Office. And we've undertaken modelling and mapping using GIS technology. And we'll take you through some of the outputs from that work. And before Christmas, we had a second workshop, again with the council and external members of different companies such as Thames Water and UK Power Networks. And in that workshop, we looked at different sectors across the borough and how they could be impacted by climate change. So we'll take you through some of the initial findings from that workshop. And in the second part of the work, which Jim just mentioned, we'll be developing an adaptation strategy, and that will be looking at, once the climate risks have been assessed and prioritised, the strategy will address what are the costs and benefits of different options to address the issues, and where across the borough needs to be prioritised in terms of actions, and what people as well are most at risk, and how can actions be tailored and prioritised to support those people most vulnerable.
Great, thanks, Francis. I'm going to run through some of the preliminary findings from the climate risk assessment. So our first slide, we're going to run through some of the historical climate events in Hammersmith and Fulham. Thank you. So the graph to the left, we can see that increase in mean annual air temperature, and that's from the 1890s to the current present day. You can see that gradual increase as the climate is warming. To the right, we have a timeline of key climate events that have occurred since 2007. Just to pick out a few, we've had the 2021 flooding event, which impacted on many residents in Hammersmith and Fulham. The 2022 heat wave in July, which saw up to 40 degrees Celsius in London. Also, the August drought that followed on from this. You can see we've kind of ended the timeline in November 2023, but we've had a lot of recent winter storms also. These are highlighted in green, but you can sort of see the amount of climate events that have occurred recently and are starting to increase. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through some of our mapping that we've completed for the climate risk assessment. So this is just indicating the metrics we've used in the mapping. So we've taken results from the Greater London Authority Bloomberg study of current surface flooding and heat risk. This takes into account vulnerability and exposure metrics. So for vulnerability, we're looking at different demographics that can be impacted the most by climate change, such as children and over 75s. We've also looked at exposure metrics. These vary between heat and flooding, as you can imagine. To run you through some of them, we've looked at changes in air quality, as this can impact on heat and the urban heat island effect in London. We've also looked at green spaces. So AOD is areas of deficiency in access to public open space. So if there's more green space, bigger areas of parks, it has this cooling effect on the climate. And then for flooding, we've looked predominantly at the risk of surface water flooding, as this is what's impacting Hammersmith and Fulham the most. We've also looked at green land cover too, as this can have a permeable effect on surface water flooding. Next slide, please. So these are some of the maps that were produced by the Greater London Authority that we've used for our analysis to see kind of that neighbourhood level risk across Hammersmith and Fulham. We've got flood risk to the left and heat risk to the right. You can see that sort of commonality between the two, as it uses the same vulnerability metrics across the two. Just to pull out some of the key kind of risk hotspots. So we've got the dense and tall buildings. These can be particularly vulnerable to high heat. Areas with smaller areas of green space, large housing estates, depots and transport infrastructure, and high streets. You can make out on the map some of the key council estates that are impacted. So Edwards Wood Estate, Fulham and Lancaster Court, and also high streets such as Hammersmith Broadway. So delving into the detail a little bit more on surface flooding. So this is current surface flooding risk. I appreciate it's quite small on the maps as it's quite a discrete variable, but probably the graph that would be most interesting to everyone is the graph to the left. We've pulled out basement properties in areas of current surface flood risk. It's quite a lot of properties, up to 4,000 for a 1 in 1,000 year flood. And that is a 0.01% chance of occurring every year. So it's quite low probability, but very high impact if it does occur. To the right, we've pulled out some of the roads that are impacted by surface flooding. This is widespread across the borough. Nearly all roads are highlighted as being in areas of surface flood risk, as it's a very impermeable surface. To pick out a few, that's Hammersmith Flyover, King Street, and Shepherd's Bush Green. Next slide, please. So we've also looked at council estate areas in current surface flood and heat risk areas. We've taken the surface flood risk data from the Environment Agency and the land surface temperature from the Greater London Authority data sets. So I'll start with the surface flood risk to the left. Appreciate it's quite difficult to see as it is that discrete risk, but we've picked out some of the key council estates which are in areas of surface flood risk. Some common estates coming up: Clem Attlee Estate, White City Estate, Edward Woods Estate. And the map to the right, we've got land surface temperature. This is from 2016 to 2020 and is summer land surface temperature. So you can see quite high heat to the south of the borough in Fulham. And this isn't taking into account the 2022 record temperatures seen. So this heat impact could be even higher in future. Next slide, please. So that's the current results for our climate risk assessment, but what will the future look like? We've looked at climate change projections for a variety of climate models. We've looked at this for two different future scenarios. So we've got RCP 4.5, which is a medium emission scenario. So this is if certain policies are in place and we're on track for around a 2.4 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. It's also best practice to look at a high emission scenario. So this is sort of a worst case. So that's up to 4 degrees Celsius warming. We've looked at summer air temperatures. So we're seeing up to around 37 degrees Celsius, up from 35. But you can see in the brackets, we've got these range of uncertainty in the climate models, and that's seeing up to 40 degrees. We know in summer 2022, these temperatures were already reached. So we're already going above what the climate models are saying. Below this, we've got annual one-day total rainfall. So this gives us an indicator of rainfall intensity and flooding. So we're seeing a slight increase in annual one-day total rainfall by the 2050s. And finally, we've got summer rainfall percentage change. So this could indicate future drought conditions. We're seeing that decrease in summer rainfall, which could indicate more drought in future. Just to note, there is high uncertainty across these climate models. They have inherent certainty, but the trends are clear. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Cara. So coming back to the workshop that I mentioned with stakeholders from across the council and other stakeholders from external to the council, we, through the workshop and a series of follow-up meetings, we conducted the climate risk assessment collaboratively with the stakeholders that joined. And for the climate risks, we assessed the impacts on 6 key sectors, which is crucial to how the council operates and the services that are provided throughout the borough. So those sectors are shown on the left-hand column. And the 4 key climate risks that we assessed are shown on the top row of the table. So those, just to summarize, are heat waves, surface water flooding, drought, and high winds and storms. And through the workshops, we were able to assess the risks and develop what you see here, the summary table. This has now been reviewed with further evidence. So this is a preliminary version you're seeing. The updated final version will be submitted in our report that we're submitting very soon to the council. But it gives you a sense of the level of risk and the prioritization of different sectors and different risks. So I guess the key message there is that heat waves are found to be the highest risk to the borough. This has probably been underappreciated in the past. And I think this is true of many major cities and many other councils as well that we've worked with, that heat has been a bit of a silent issue in the past, that there hasn't been the recognition of the amount of productivity losses and also health impacts, and even in some cases death that's been caused by heat waves. But certainly that the awareness is rising for heat, whereas surface water flooding is probably not surprisingly also a very high risk, but this has been far more evident and obvious in the past. So it's something that the council and the borough has already done a lot of work around. But those two are the ones that have come out as the most significant climate risks that we'll continue to build on as we start the work on the adaptation strategy. So the final slide, please. So yeah, I've just mentioned there, the report that we'll be delivering to the council will be summarising all the work we've just mentioned and containing lots of the detail as well, more mapping and more of the climate projections. We'll be submitting that this week to the council, and then that will go through a period of review, and we'll revise that in our final deliverables in May, and that will include work on the adaptation strategy. And so under that adaptation strategy, we're again working with different departments across the council, assessing their readiness and understanding of the impacts of climate change and how it will impact on the services that those departments deliver. And we're building the evidence base for the costs and benefits of taking action to mitigate against these impacts. Thank you, and happy to have any questions.
Thank you very much for that. Should we take questions now, or should we move on? I think we'll take questions now. I would first like to point out what sort of glaringly obvious to me is that, particularly with the heat impact, is that the estates seem to be most at risk, and that therefore focuses that there's a disproportionate effect on the lowest income, because that's our social housing, and so that whole group are more impacted by heat. But also by surface flooding as well. I mean, could you possibly describe the specific geography of the estates, of why are they most impacted by heat and flood risk? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, thank you. So a few indicators or variables, I suppose, that make estates more susceptible or at risk. Cara mentioned particularly on high-rise council buildings or flats. So yeah, I suppose hot air rises, and with more exposure to solar gain as well, with less shading, and the higher that residents live, they'll be experiencing warmer temperatures, or certainly their flats will heat up warmer. Many properties as well may only have one single aspect, which means they may only have windows on one side of the building. Sometimes that in some properties there's cross-flow ventilation, so you can open a window on two sides. That helps to cool down buildings, but not all buildings. So quite often high-rise flats may only have windows on one side, for example. So that doesn't necessarily help with cooling down. So those are two of the kind of physical built reasons around the buildings, but certainly indicators of vulnerability is a big factor. So in social housing, there's often a higher proportion of older residents, perhaps disabled residents, people who may be already vulnerable because of health conditions. And so all of those things become amplified during heat waves, for example. So with heat waves, one of the key things is that people don't sleep as well during heat. It's hard to get enough sleep, and lack of sleep amplifies existing health conditions. It also affects children quite a lot. Children don't sleep, and that then affects their parents. It affects pregnant women, for example, who are already overheating because of carrying a child. So those are some of the those are some of the factors that make people more vulnerable during heat waves.
Thanks very much for that. And I forgot to say thank you very much for coming in, and Cara and Francis, and your fantastic presentation. Just on a follow-up to that, I see that you're basically workshopping these things and looking at the whole borough. Will you start looking at ideas from Europe, where they have sort of lived with heat more so than we have, and have brought in mitigating factors already? I was just thinking of the high rise, awnings are probably a new thing to us, but over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot to learn from other cities and other places that have been dealing with heat for a long period of time. And also the UK Government Environmental Audit Committee just published its review into heat resilience 2 weeks ago, which I fed into as well. So there's some really good evidence there that can be used in the adaptation strategy. Some measures are quite simple, like awnings, shading. Other measures, such as retrofitting buildings so that they have more windows or ventilation, are more complex, but can also be looked into. So all of those things will be considered in the adaptation strategy.
Fantastic, thank you. Do we have any immediate questions from the members? Councillor James.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And I was particularly interested in your comment on sleep hygiene and the impact of environmental factors on that. So are there any sort of potential strategies for linking up with public health to try and deal with that?
I can take that one if that's
Yeah,
helpful. So
anyone who can answer.
yeah, absolutely. So we're working with our public health colleagues very closely on this, as in all agendas. So the climate and ecology emergency is very much public health emergency. So our public health colleagues have been involved in the workshops that we've held to date, along with social care and children's services colleagues as well, feeding in around some of those kind of areas that are going to be the most vulnerable. So things like our care homes, also kind of thinking about home care, where you've got residents who may be more vulnerable inside their own homes, and how we can kind of use those contact points to kind of identify where there might be sort of higher risk to people. It's going to be sort of really key to that. Don't know if you have anything to add to that, you two.
Just to say that as part of the assessments, we're looking into the policies and plans of the council as well, and we're looking at the public health strategies and plans. So yes, we will look at identifying opportunities for greater link up in future as well.
Councillor Antionadis, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, fascinating. It's kind of on a similar vein to what Nicole has talked about. Obviously, heat is the biggest risk, and you talked about floods as well with water. And so, is there a common theme with the flats in terms of how they collect water, or is there have you noticed different variations on that as well? And are there any thoughts on how that will be mitigated? Again, looking at examples abroad too.
So in terms of how the council flats may be susceptible to flood risk as well?
Is there a common way that they're susceptible? Is it the balconies? Is it the ground levels where where are the common elements, or are they all different in their different contexts?
Yeah. So there are some commonalities which was indicated on some of the mapping we showed. It's particularly areas that are lacking in green space. So they'll be more susceptible to heat because of the urban heat island effect, but also they'll be more susceptible potentially to surface water flooding because of lower ability to absorb and allow surface water to permeate into the ground. So that's one indicator that sort of overlaps. With surface water flooding, one of the main risk hotspots across the borough is for basement properties. So we showed the map of basement properties. I'm not sure that we have the count on how many of those would be council flats, but that could be something we look further into if possible. I don't know if you've got any more to add.
Yeah, I was just thinking more with the flat roofs and the balconies and things, if they could be, changes could be made to those. But only if it's a risk, I don't know how well the drainage is on those. So
sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I guess the level of detail we've gone into is more of a strategic borough-wide review, probably not as granular as that, looking at the built form itself in terms of the balconies or roof pitches, for example. But you're absolutely right. Those all could be potential areas for solutions. Green roofs, for example, or green walls are things that will be incorporated in part of the adaptation strategies, things that could be brought into action. But we won't get to the level with this work. We won't get to the level of saying in this street, this measure should be installed in this building. It will be more about the types of solutions that would be able to be applied for the types of risks that are being seen.
I would just add to that, in our capital programs, we're looking for those kind of opportunities at the moment. So in our housing capital program, we're incorporating cool roofs, for instance, into our West Kensington estate works. So looking at how, so that's more of a kind of heat reduction measure. So looking at how you can use the reflection to kind of reduce some of that risk of overheating in summer, and also looking for opportunities for green roofs as well, as we have on the Queen Caroline estate, for instance.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I could remind guests and committee to speak up, just so that the audience can hear, and speak into your mics, just so that the residents that have come can hear. But I'm going to hand over to Councillor Melton to ask a further question before we see the kind of flood water thing sort of seeks onto the Thames Water presentation. So, but I will hand over.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Atkins Reales team, for a sobering report. As part of your strategic assessment, was any assessment made of the costs of the historic climate events that you highlighted, particularly in increased use of unforecasted use of council services and reduced economic activity?
Thank you. So we will be undertaking more of the assessments on costs into previous events. We have cost information kind of at a macro level about impacts that have been reported, for example, in terms of impacts on the economy in London or on disruption to transport, but we don't yet have detailed impacts on the council itself. So that's yeah, a very good question that we'll be probing further into around about the disturbance and the disruption for council services, or the increased expenditure to recover from some of those events.
Thank you, Francis. I'm delighted to hear that this is going to form a key part of your next phase of your project. As we're all acutely aware around these tables, and both in the audience, we need to know the cost of inaction to justify comprehensive and decisive action.
Councillor Harcourt would like to come in before we introduce Thames Water. Carry on.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Just a few comments, really, and really to say that this report and the study on adaptation and such like is really, really timely. We spent so much time focusing on climate change, looking at it in terms of carbon offsets and all that sort of thing. But at the moment, what you can see, was it nine local storms now? Today, there's ridiculous levels of floods in Death Valley in California and places which haven't seen rain for about 40 years. So things are changing, and the heat waves and that table of yours of various events, the timeline is really, really telling. And it says that adaptation is perhaps the more urgent issue that we need to consider. And things that you've mentioned already are really work that we need to undertake. You mentioned roofs and water and such like. There's enough evidence around to show that blue-green developments can reduce local temperatures by 4 degrees centigrade. And, you know, when you're talking about that sort of thing, then it's important. And things like our climate change SDP, the planning guidance, has some of this stuff in it. So can I draw people's attention to that as well? But, you know, the work you're doing, I think, is absolutely essential.
Yeah, that's the supplementary planning document that was agreed. Yeah, we looked at it at the previous PAC, but it is worth having a look at. Now, there's somebody from the gallery who'd like to speak now. We do have a Thames Water presentation on water, but if you'd like to come forward, perhaps there's a microphone with Councillor Harcourt. Thank you. If you could introduce yourself and your question, that would be great.
Thank you. My name is Pete Knapp, a resident from the Edward Woods. I'm an air quality researcher, so I thought I'd step in at this point. So we know that air pollution increases with heat waves. You had that coming up, right? So we know that when nitrogen dioxide, for example, from diesel cars reacts with agricultural emissions from elsewhere, we get an increase of PM 2.5. But firstly, are those health impacts included in the risk from heat waves? And secondly, are there strategies that the council can implement to reduce the sources of these emissions during heat waves? For example, reducing traffic when there's a heat wave.
Thank you for a great question. So absolutely, in terms of the assessments across the sectors, we did consider impacts from heat waves in terms of health, including air quality impacts. But this is definitely something that we believe can be strengthened in the plans and policies that the council has. So your second part of the question, I think, is a good point around what sort of measures could be taken. We can bring that into the adaptation strategy around some of those operational measures, for example, because the focus of the work that we've been commissioned for is on capital solutions. But I absolutely agree with you that some of the operational measures, things that can be temporarily adjusted, are really important as well. So I think that's a really good point.
Thank you. And we have another question from the gallery. If you'd like to use the microphone.
Evening, everybody. Casey Aberoni. Thanks for your report. One of the things I noted in it was how Fulham is suffering from a higher heat density than actually the north of the borough. And it confirmed what has been a sneaking suspicion of mine, which is that we are losing forest cover. We are deforesting in Fulham at a gradual but insidious rate. A lot of this is actually on private land, according to my observations. It's not so much the street trees which are on public domain, but a lot of the trees that are in private residences. I don't know, again, because this is just anecdotal observation. In fact, no research behind this. I haven't done any formal or informal research behind this. But is there anything that can be done? Is there an approach that can look at addressing forest cover loss or tree loss on private property?
Thanks, Casey. That's a really good point to raise. So yes, your anecdotal instincts are right. So the areas of particularly kind of high heat readings map very clearly onto areas of less green space. And we've commissioned some research recently on private spaces, which found that I think it was about almost half of private gardens in the borough are completely paved, which poses huge flooding risks and overheating risks to the borough. In terms of what could be done, we don't have a huge amount of control over existing private gardens. That's not covered within our sort of planning policy powers. What we are trying to do is encourage people where we can with more carrot than stick. So we've been doing free tree giveaways, for instance, to encourage people to plant in their own gardens as well. But it's a big kind of communication challenge, I think, because actually a lot of the climate adaptation risk to the borough is controlled by private people, private businesses on their land. Thank you.
Unfortunately, one of the times at which this seems to occur most is in when properties that are in transition. As such, it's hard to sort of like address this with the new residents. Would it be estate agents or developers then? Who would be the best people to try to inform and educate about this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It is everyone, really. I mean, new development is better governed by policies that are in place. So there are policies like the urban greening factor and biodiversity net gain that mean that new developments should be increasing the amount of green space and including more ecologically friendly green space as well. So developers certainly do need to be engaged, but they're more governed by policy. I think where most engagement is needed is with private residents and also with the organisations in the borough as well. So finding opportunities to green our grey spaces. And I think the council can support with that in through engagement, through events like this, and also through kind of things like giving away bulbs, giving away trees that kind of help people to green in low-cost ways.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Thames Water for their presentation on flooding in Hammersmith and Fulham. Thanks.
I'm just waiting for the slides. Thank you and good evening. My name is Graham Castleman. I work for Thames Water, and my role there is the long-term planning manager for London. We'd like to talk very briefly about following on from July 2021. You're all acutely aware of the extensive flooding we had in July 2021. We've put a map on the screen showing the... I'll go closer to the microphone. Is that a bit better? Okay. We put a map on the screen showing the intensity of the rainfall event. The dark colors are high rainfall, the light colors are low rainfall, and you'll see a really clear band that crossed over large parts of London on that day. About 2,000 homes have reported flooding to us since that.
Seems to be some confusion on that.
Okay, it's definitely the one on the screen I'm talking to.
Don't worry, they're up on the screen. But... Would that be okay? Thank you.
If they're going to Councillor Harcourt, then at least you're sort of able to address us all.
Absolutely no problem. Right, let me go nice and close. Roughly about 2,000 properties across London reported flooding to us at that point. We initiated two activities very shortly after the flooding. The first was an independent review, which was done externally, which we funded, and the one was an internal review. Both of those review documents are available and publicly accessible on our website. The external one is fairly comprehensive, but it's all there and all available. And that's really kicked off a whole bunch of activities. So Jim, if you don't mind moving over to the next slide. What we did following that was initiate what we've called our sewer flooding resilience program. We've initially committed about £10 million, a further 4 million to come, and potentially further on that in the future. The intention behind that is to survey properties that reported flooding to us in that event. If properties did flood and have not yet reported, it is not too late, and we will happily take reports even in the next few months. It's absolutely no problem if they haven't reported it. We will do a survey of their property, and then we will understand what mitigation measures we can put into place, recognizing that some things are within our control and we can fix, and some things are a little bit more difficult. So there's the water company element to this, and there's the local authority element. We will fit one of the 3 devices if suitable. And those are the little images you can see on the screen on the top right-hand corner. The first one is called a non-return valve. That means it allows water to go in one direction only, and you don't get flooded back from the sewer. The second one is just a fancy version of that called a WAS stop. It's a flexible valve that goes in the pipe. And the third one is a pumped alternative. The pumped ones give a slightly better level of protection, but are not suitable for all homes. And we have a program that we're rolling out at the moment to do the survey on the properties, determine if they are suitable for this level of protection, and then implement the protection. In addition to that, we've taken all the properties we received and we've prioritized them based on a series of factors, and the high priority ones are being done first, and then we'll get to the lower priority ones over time. On the right-hand side of the screen, there's just some current performance data on where the program runs. And this is about 2 weeks old because we submitted the slides about 2 weeks ago to you. It changes every day as more surveys get done, and just gives you an indication of roughly the numbers involved. In the end, it's about 385 properties in London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham that we expect will get some form of protection through this program. Jim, if you can move us on one more, please.
Sure. Could I just point out to councillors, you will see these slides later on in the slide deck. I think we've moved to the third presentation second, which is what you want. Yeah.
Okay. That's about the short term. As your adaptation team has clearly said, there's a longer term issue here as well. And as part of the longer term issue, there's a few key things we want to deliver. The first and most obvious one is completion and operation of the Thames Tideway Tunnel. That will predominantly help with reducing, it's not a flood risk asset. It's a asset required to improve water quality. But by the way it was built and configured, it will help flood risk, especially close to the riverfront. So the Thames Tidal Tunnel is the first and important one on our measure. Thereafter, we would like to continue and extend the £14 million we've already committed into terms of the flood resilience program and run that for a few years until we've done as much as we can for homes that flooded in July 2021. Following that, we're looking at more longer term activities. In parallel to this, we've had a series of studies regarding the long-term impacts of population growth and climate change across London. The most common one is called the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan. It is at the moment non-statutory. It becomes statutory with the Environment Act, and it will be repeated on a 5-year cycle. The map you can see on the image and the data in the second half of the table are really the outputs from the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan. Our focus is clearly a green focus. We don't think the right answer is to build a whole bunch of more pipes. We think it is to put sustainable engineering in. That is provides us with a very strong basis, but it also provides a whole bunch of those wider benefits discussed earlier. It should help with urban greening. It should help with urban heat and all those other factors. We don't count those too much in our assessment. We're focused predominantly on the water element of it, but we know that that provides a wider benefit. The Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan says that roughly in what you can see is the green areas on the map, which is more than just your borough, it's some of your neighbouring boroughs, there's about £1.7 billion of investment required, predominantly through green engineering, but that won't go far enough. Some pipe network will need to be constructed as well. And that is an objective to make sure that by 2050, we have mitigated all the impacts due to climate change. So homes that have no risk of flooding now still have no risk of flooding in the future, up to a 1 in 50-year rainfall period, as well as improve the position. So a fair amount of that expenditure will affect that homes that are at risk of flooding today no longer have risk by 2050. And if we can move on one more slide, please. The other thing that happened out of the external review we undertook was we formed the London Surface Water Strategic Group. One of the strong recommendations from the independent review was there is no existing body or membership across London where all the authorities responsible for flood risk can collaborate. And that was, we recognize, as well as many other organizations, recognize as quite a big shortfall. The strategic group was therefore formed in December 2022. The strategic group has already commissioned a London-wide surface water strategy, which we'll probably see in the springtime of this year. And that will give us a lot of guidance into terms of how we not just manage flood risk in local pockets areas, but how, because water doesn't obey administrative boundaries, how we can collectively work with across borough boundaries to make sure that if there is flood risk that can be mitigated in Hammersmith and Fulham, but the intervention is potentially in Camden, or similarly, if there's flood risk in Westminster, where the mitigation is potentially in Hammersmith and Fulham, we'll understand what linkages and how those linkages are dependent on each other. So we're eagerly anticipating the first results of the Surface Water Strategic Group. One more slide, if I remember correctly. As I've mentioned before, we have promoted a SUDS first approach. Our intention is to do this through green engineering. Our intention is to do this in collaboration with partners, the highways authorities, investment in places like public realm areas, in council-owned property, because that's really accessible. And Hammersmith and Fulham have a great record of delivering green engineering on some of your council-owned property already. To build up to that, for the last 10 years, we have been running a bidding program where local authorities, lead local authorities, can apply for a grant from us. If they meet a set of criteria, we will agree to fund schemes. We have funded schemes at Hammersmith and Fulham before, and in many other London boroughs. And we have a much better uptake in London than outside of London. So we hope to continue that and move that on into the future. But our focus is very clearly to do green engineering as our primary solution, and then top that up with underground grey storage where necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that presentation, and thanks for coming along. I think I'd really like to start with a couple of numbers. Now, you're saying that you've spent £10 million on resilience features, and you're committing another £4 million. But Thames Water, up to March 31st of March 22, the annual report found that Thames Water made revenue of £2 billion, and the profit before interest, taxes and depreciation was around £1 billion to that 12 months. 10 million sounds derisory. I mean, if you look at what the council spends on infrastructure, that figure is a drop in the ocean.
Hello, my name is Mike Benke. I'm the Stakeholder Engagement Manager for North London. So regarding the figures on profit, yes, we did report those. A lot of I'm not an accountant, so apologies if there are any accountants in the room. A lot of those profit figures are a result of gearing. Essentially, it's a figure of our debt in terms of value of companies and value of the company and things like that. It's the example that was given to me. It's essentially the value of if your value of your home was to go up by 20,000, you don't have 20,000 in your pocket. It's along those. And the cash profit was, I believe, a slight loss, broadly even. The reality is that a lot of our big spending is decided within 5-year business cycles. So every 5 years, we put together a business plan. We submit this to Ofwat, and it tells us essentially how much money we can raise through bills and what money we can spend that on. So we are currently in the 2020 to 2025 period, known as AMP7 within the industry. And so when that plan was put in 2020, we were allocated the funds to spend on certain things. Now, these storms happened in 2021, and basically Bevilles had to kind of take money from other projects and other schemes to put towards this. We don't suddenly have hundreds of millions of pounds sitting available to spend on these schemes.
Yeah, no,
Sorry. If I manage just to add a few important notes to that, Thames Water is predominantly owned by pension funds. So the people who own us are BT's pension fund, the University Supernumerary Pension Fund. That holding company has not received a dividend from us in the last 4 years and is not forecast to receive a dividend for another 3 years' time.
But when Thames Water was privatised in 1989, it had no deficit, and it currently runs at 14.7 billion in.
Thames Water and all water companies' deficit is regulated by Ofwat. So if you look at our commitments, there's a statutory requirement.
Thames Water to be not behaving properly. A report early last year found that you were not engaging with the rules exactly on this.
Yes, you're entirely right. We're not going to argue that, and I'm also not going to sit here and defend the actions of previous owners. It's before my time, but I'm not going to sit here and say that. I'm also not going to sit here and say that our previous management have made the right decision. Have always made the right decisions. We've got things wrong. Unquestionably, we are not where we should be as a business. We're not where our customers should expect us to be, or rightfully expect us to be as a business. What we can say is that since 2017, as Graham said, we have new owners in pension funds and a few overseas. As I say, since then, they've not taken a dividend, and actually it's even further than that. They're not expecting to take a dividend until 2030. On top of that, they are putting money into the business. So last year, they put £500 million in. We're in talks for another 750 from them. We currently expect to spend, for example, in this AMP period, about £1 billion more than we've raised through bills. So yes, we're not seeing, historically, we've got things wrong. Both I could say, I'm not going to defend my owners, but certainly our previous owners, but and the management have made mistakes. We've got a new CEO who started about a month ago, and we are working to fix that.
Yeah, a new CEO, because the last CEO left, didn't she? Because she couldn't carry on as CEO whilst defending the finances. We have just been looking at the budget of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, and if we compare it to Thames Water, it's a shocking report. Now, going back to Ofwat, it seems that you are going to need the investment from your investors, because you were fined 3 million for a 6-hour sewage dumping in the Thames last year. You were fined 51 million by Ofwat for failing to reach performance targets. Are these just overheads, these fines, or are you taking seriously your role in our city?
Absolutely, we are taking this, and we know we took the fines, and as I've said, we've got things wrong. I'm not sitting here to defend the indefensible, and pollutions in particular. We know they are unacceptable, but we are taking action. Next year, the Thames Tideway Tunnel comes online. That will cut pollutions into the Thames, the tidal Thames, by 95%. Last 2 years ago, for example, the Lee Tunnel was brought online. That's had huge impact on the Channel Sea River, where recently independent studies were carried out, and fish life that hadn't been there for years was found back and coming back. We are taking the action. We know sewage discharges are unacceptable, and we are committing funds to tackle those.
I appreciate the Thames Tideway is a development and a positive move. We will come on to sewage in a bit, but I'm going to go back to where we were at with the floods of July 2021. You say in your flooding review in November 2021 that you carried out, that you admit that the service you provided fell short. But you actually don't mention that your call centre were advising customers that this is not a Thames Water issue, but you have to contact Hammersmith and Fulham Council. I speak from personal experience. And from both storms in July 2021, you confirm you cleaned up 252 properties. That's in both storms. But in the same report, you admit receiving thousands of calls during those storms, double the normal amount, and 6,000 social media messages. 252 properties. Let's go back to your figures. You have put in 10 non-return valves. 10. Sorry. I mean, this is derisory, the work that you've done to mitigate for the future, but to reimburse residents and tenants for the damage that was done. It seems, I mean, July 2021 is practically 3 years ago. You have put in 10 non-return valves. Could you answer why that, 190 being thought about? It's just not good enough.
Well, I'd say just as everyone will be aware, the storm in 2021 was a massive storm, one of the most intense we've ever seen. The level of rain was well beyond what our drainage systems, indeed anyone's drainage systems in London, were designed to cope with. We were very quickly, and just add, it wasn't forecast either. It caught everyone by surprise. It overwhelmed our systems very quickly. And you're right. One of our failures was we weren't expecting that level of rain. When suddenly, as you say, thousands and thousands of people contacted us at once, our call centre very quickly became overwhelmed. We can't have a call centre that's on standby to handle thousands of calls at one go. But we understand that our messaging wasn't particularly clear on those days, and in some cases, well, in quite a few cases, the incorrect message was given out, and we've learned from that. Training has been given to staff. There's clearer messaging on our website. We've worked with local authorities to clarify that message, because I'm certainly not washing our hands of this at all. But dealing with floods like this isn't solely Thames Water's responsibility. It isn't solely the local authorities. It's lots of boroughs who have lots of organisations who have a responsibility to deal with those flooding. But yes, we got things. And regarding the cleanup, to my understanding, most people who contacted, yes, we were a bit slow getting onto site, but to my knowledge, most households who contacted us for a cleanup received one, to my knowledge.
The data we supplied was customized for Hammersmith and Fulham. We have done work in other boroughs. The flooding did not just affect this borough. And that's quite important to note. So we haven't just done 10. We've done more in Camden and we've done more in Westminster as well, because they were also affected by the flooding.
Yeah,
And in addition to that, as soon as we initiated the program, our flooding reporting went from about 1,200 to 1,700 properties. So that is 500 homes who chose not to tell us they flooded. And when they realized that intervention was going to be proposed, they then reported flooding. We therefore reprofiled all those properties in to make sure that they are also considered and are treated fairly, even though they didn't report the flooding initially.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions at the moment?
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned 384 properties in your survey programme. When is that projected to be complete for Hammersmith and Fulham?
I don't have all the data in front of me today. The survey program that's out will be completed and the implementation will be done in this calendar year. And then we are starting the work on the second round of surveys for the less vulnerable properties, and we're passing that through our internal governance at the moment. So we can come back to you with the exact date, but I don't have it just for Hammersmith and Fulham. I've got, unfortunately, for the entire program.
All right. How long does the average survey take per property?
The challenge with the surveys is more arranging them than actually doing them. They're fairly short-lived. It's a few hours, probably a morning. You can do more than one property. It's the challenge is more to make sure you've found a time, got hold of the owner or the resident of the property, booked a time that's suitable to them, that type of activity.
And just to add on to that, then there's the results of that survey need to be modelled into what other data that we have in the area. We won't if for example, we won't install a device if we think it will just pass flood risk on to the neighbour. So that has to be modelled into it as well. So it can take a number of months for that to be done.
You don't have to.
Councillor Antinardis first.
Just a very quick one on detail. I know I go in on detail a little bit, but obviously the tideway infrastructure will help. What can you give us the date when that is going to be done? And you said it would also mitigate 95% of pollution into the Thames, but we still, what's going to happen with the 5%? It's still not good enough. You know, we want 100% clean rivers. We don't want anything discharged. So
the tideway tunnel is delivered by a third party, and they're completely independent. It'll be not owned by Thames Water customers. It'll be owned by the third party, and they're responsible for the deadline. The deadline they've released to us is that they propose to start commissioning at the second half of this year, end of October time. They will flex their commissioning based on rainfall. So they would like to see some very large storms, and they will extend the commissioning window to make sure that they get those very large storms. So it's anything from a 12 to an 18-month commissioning period. Half of that will be low intensity rainfall. They'll half fill the tunnel. The second half will be hopefully some high intensity rainfall where they'll fill the tunnel. And the tunnel's therefore expected to, it will do full commissioning 2025, and that may run into 2026, just depending on the rainfall. And from 2026, 27, 28, it goes through a 3-year optimization window where changes can be made, operating techniques can be adjusted, and then it will permanently run in a kind of a non-amended state from 2028 onwards. At that point, Thames Water will operate it. The constructors operate it up till then.
how much, I mean, okay, so I appreciate it's third party, but how much will it improve for Hammersmith and Fulham, do you think?
In terms of flood risk?
Yeah.
We haven't done the assessment at a property level because the challenge is around the basements. And you've got to understand exactly what we have assessed is how the water runs in the sewer network and how much it will drop. On the foreshore, the level of the water in the sewer will drop up to 1 meter just because of the tideway tunnel. It's also important to note that the independent review modeled the implications of if the Tideway Tunnel was in operation in July 2021 storms, and the detail is in there. It is a fairly small impact because the storm was so large.
Okay, thanks.
And just to kind of follow up on your, we say 95 to 96, those final few percent are for the extreme with the heavy weather. So just for context, the amount of rain which fell over the Counters Creek catchment in a few hours was about 150% of the capacity of the Tideway Tunnel. We are talking huge amounts of water. Okay, obviously they are particularly extreme, but for those very, very heavy weather where huge amounts of water are coming down, that's what the Tideway won't pick up. The long-term strategy for preventing those is surface water management that we mentioned earlier on. That will take a bit of time.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Would you like a follow-up? Are you okay? Councillor James.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your candor. You said earlier that dumping sewage in the Thames is not acceptable. Will you stop?
We're doing everything. Long term, the aim is to reduce it. Also, yes, it is to cut it out. But it's I can't give you those.
The requirement to stop discharging sewage is national government regulated. It's called the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan. It was published by government about 2 years ago. It is a national requirement that discharges will be reduced, not stopped, by 2050. And we are funded through Ofwat to meet the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan.
Obviously, the requirements set by national government are one thing, but you've just told us it's unacceptable. What are your plans to reduce it in the short term?
In the short term, for this part of London is the Tideway Tunnel. The Tideway Tunnel has done the assessment of the impact of compliance with the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan and does meet it up to 2080.
So you've just told us that's not going to be fully operational till 2028.
Yes. No, I didn't say that. I said that the transfer of operation will move from the constructor to Thames Water in 2028. I said that full commissioning will start next year, at which 100% of the tunnel will be used and it will start providing benefit.
So at what point, just so I'm clear, because obviously it's all very, very technical what you're giving us, at what point can we expect to see a significant reduction in the level of sewage being dumped in the Thames in our area?
At the point where the operator moves from a 50% commissioning to 100% commissioning, and they haven't disclosed that yet.
So that's, sorry. So just so I understand that, is that likely to
be? It is expected to be in 2025.
Expected to be in
2025.
Okay. I do have a few follow on, so sorry. Apologies. You mentioned the funding cycle. So presumably you've already got plans ahead for the 2025 to 2030 funding cycle. Will you be allocating more funding to deal with emergencies and the fallout from the 2021 storms for the next funding cycle?
The cycle we submitted a draft to Ofwat. We submitted it in October last year. They will provide a response probably the middle of this year. We're expecting it in June, at which point we will submit around about September time a final submission to Ofwat. That then gets ministerial sign-off in December 2024, and the funding starts from April 2025.
Yes, but
that's
I think that's the cycle. But my question is, within your submission, have you allocated sufficient funding to rectify the damage we've talked about today and to factor for similar occurrences?
Within our submission, there is funding to extend the resilience program to make sure we have covered all the properties.
To make sure you have?
We have covered all the properties that reported flooding in July 2021.
So it will cover all the damage from 2021?
It will cover, where appropriate, to install mitigation measures to properties that have flooded in July 2021.
And what about future proofing?
At present, there is nothing in our short-term plans up to 2030 for this area that covers future proofing.
Very disappointing. You talked about the survey and being in contact with residents. Could you just clarify how you're communicating to residents so they can get the survey?
So I believe from memory, we wrote to every property that had reported flooding to us, I believe to the local, that flooded to the local authority, but we also contacted their neighbours and properties that our modelling suggested had flooding. So, for example, if number 7 and number 3 had reported flooding, there's a good guess that number 5, they may not have reported to us, but number 5 had flooding. So we contacted them. We wrote 3 letters in total to each property where we had contact details that we would send emails. We would door knock as best we could. I'm shaking your head.
I'm sorry, but I shouldn't bring my personal into it, but I haven't heard from you. My property flooded, as I said, this is a non-pecuniary interest, but I'm not sure that your communications are getting through.
Then we would say we only went to people who actively formally reported flooding to us via that way. If you have and you haven't, as Graham said, the scheme, as I said, I'm talking to you on your personal terms, the scheme is still open, and we haven't closed it down. People who haven't.
I think that's the nature of my question. What are you doing now to make sure that Councillor Trahey and others, and particularly others, it's not about her personal issues here today, but others in our borough are aware what public information apart from coming here today, for which we are grateful, are you promoting to make sure people are fully aware that they can
when the scheme launched, as well as letters and things, we used social media, I think local social media groups. We contacted community groups as well. I don't have the list, the ones within Hammersmith to hand, but we did do quite extensive for about 6 months, which is one of the reasons for the delay. The first 6 months or 8 months or so was focused on trying to capture as many people as possible. The figure in front of me was about 1,500 that we reached out to, and as you can see, for the numbers of people who've come back to us, it is lower than we would have liked to. There are a lot of people who, for a variety of reasons, aren't coming forward.
I would just suggest that going forward, thank you very much for coming, that this might be a point that you need to take on board, that those communications, we haven't seen them as residents of Hammersmith and Fulham, and that maybe you need to have a relook at communications going forward. One of our recommendations, perhaps.
Well, perhaps then, just as a follow-on to that, could you come back to us with your action plan? Because presumably it's a tight window between now and when you're finished doing these surveys. Could you come back to us with your action plan for making sure that residents in our borough are going to be fully aware of your survey offer? So I'm sorry, I do have a few more follow-on questions. You've talked about high priority, certain properties being more high priority than others. What is your criteria for that? And are you factoring in particular health and vulnerability issues of our residents?
Yes, we are. So we use a priority services register. It is a register shared across multiple utility organizations where people, for instance, are reliant on dialysis machines and therefore require permanent access to water or other factors like that. And so there are non-water related factors that do account for the priority that we use.
Thank you.
So yes. Our first priority, was people who lived in highly vulnerable properties, high risk properties, and were considered to have a risk. For example, an elderly person who lived in a basement flat with mobility issues. We would prioritise them for a flip as an example.
Thank you. That's good to know. And my last question, be glad to know. You made the point that, and I accept that, you can't have thousands of people waiting in a call centre just in case there's a sort of one-off storm. I understand that. But having now had that experience, what is your we've heard the presentation earlier about how volatile the weather is with the environmental changes. What are your contingency plans if there were to be a similar occurrence to the storms of 2021 to make sure people can get hold of you?
So Yes, something had to start with this. Firstly, as Graham mentioned, we commissioned an internal review as well. We say we accepted our response wasn't good enough, an internal review of what went wrong and how we could improve. And that report is available on our website. If you just Google Thames Water London floods or something, it'll take you to the link. So that all sets out the action that we've taken on there. But it essentially, without wanting to get too technical on internal terms, we have what's known as an incident structure that would be stood up during an issue like this. What went wrong in 2021 was it didn't. It wasn't stood up. The call centre was essentially struggling, didn't pass on to the operational team because all our assets were functioning as they should. So that was where it fell down and why it wasn't stood up. That wouldn't happen again. Mitigations have been put in to make sure that wouldn't happen. And so we would liaise with local authorities at an operational level, so our teams on the site could go to the hotspots, the impacted areas most by flooding, because that was one area that failed on. Messaging would go on our website straight away, which didn't do, to explain, yes, we're aware they're a problem. This is who to contact for the necessary types of flooding. We put messages out on social media. Updates would go out to, on a scale of London flooding, it would be senior councillors rather than every ward councillor, but would go out to elected officials to inform them on what we were doing. So there'd be far clearer communications. They'd be far more responsive on the ground, and there are more people within the call centre who are trained on this. Now, look, I'm not going to sit here and say that if 2,000 people called within a few hours, there wouldn't be waits. Unfortunately, we would struggle to ever get to a situation where that wouldn't be a problem. But hopefully this time, by using proper messaging on the website, on social media, and to yourselves as stakeholders, we could alleviate some of those calls, but certainly that volume of calls.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to follow up on that because I'm still a bit confused. You have appreciated that there was an event, a storm event that caught you off guard in 2021, but we're hearing that these events are likely to happen again. So, for example, in your report, you talk about water butts, but what are you doing to communicate that to anyone that the mitigations have to be done now, and it doesn't seem to be going quick enough?
Yes, it's not going quick enough, but I think it's as I think was mentioned earlier on, managing flood risk and surface water flood risk isn't solely on Thames Water. We can't. It's surface water sits with other authorities, but we are trialing schemes within Redbridge, which also experienced flooding in 2021. We've been working with the local authority there to trial a scheme of water butts, because there's no point us investing in thousands and thousands of water butts and then them sitting idle, because that's what we have found, that there has been very limited take up on some of these. So there is work to be done to go, actually, how do we engage people on these important subjects? So work is being done on that, and as Graham mentioned in the presentation, there's been the establishment of the Surface Water Strategic Flood Group. And that's one of the things it's looking at. One of those isn't just managing risk across the capital, but it's also how do we best communicate that to residents who are at risk of flooding. How do we communicate them, and how do we help them protect themselves? Because there's no point us doing a bit of a piecemeal, then local authority doing a bit of piecemeal, and nothing really being joined up. So it's about how we get a joined up, coordinated campaign to highlight risk to people.
Yes, but when I talk about Thames Water making a profit, these aren't unconnected. We all are paying for a service, and you have been consistently found to not be delivering the service that people should expect of you. So, the lack of investment in upgrading for 30 years is not a new thing. It's, the storms of 2021, yes, they were an unusually large event, but at the same time, no work has been done to mitigate those big events. The sewage being pumped into the Thames. We have 4 sites in Hammersmith and Fulham where sewage is regularly dumped into the Thames. Now, this isn't an extreme weather event. This is kind of all the time. There's a website that monitors, and we are seeing ridiculous amounts of sewage, and that's not when there's a huge rainfall. That is every week of the year. So we are happy. This is why we're concentrating your minds on this right now, because you can't take the money. I mean, you've gone to Ofwat, or you've gone to question about whether you can raise water rates next year, so that to pay what are we paying for exactly? Because the £10 million that you've spent in 2.5 years has not helped more than 200 residents. Do you see what I mean?
We've previously mentioned that our owners have taken no profit for the last 4 years and are not intended to take a profit. So there is no profit. Let's just repeat that again. There is no profit. And be clear on that. Reports
that that 37.5 million was paid in dividends. They reported that on the 3rd of December 2023. That's not true. No dividends were paid.
So as you mentioned, the debt that we sit in, that we have, sits within what's known as I'm slightly going out of my comfort zone here, so apologies. And if I do inadvertently say something, I will write. I'll correct. But our debt sits within a holding company, so those 37 million was going to pay down those debt. Now, formally, it's classed, because that sits as our owner, it's formally a dividend. But in terms of our external owners, they have not taken a dividend.
Yeah, no, you don't need to be a maths genius to work out that the owners of Thames Water over the last 30 years have got the company into £14.7 billion worth of debt. And to service that debt, you want to raise water rates next year, but it's not paying dividends. It's paying off a debt.
Okay. Our debt is regulated. So if you look at the Ofwat guidance, they specify an item called gearing. Ofwat dictates how much debt water companies has, and we have to achieve that debt we have to meet that debt to achieve our savings. So let's be really clear on where the responsibility lies for the debt of all water companies across England, not Wales, because they're slightly different, and that is regulated by national government. Regarding your comment about paying infrastructure and not receiving services, we have spent about £200 million in the current period making sure we can treat the wastewater from Hammersmith and Fulham and other parts of London. While there's a huge amount of that's been done at Beckton Sewage Works at the moment, there's a huge amount of investment that falls outside of your borough because of the context and the way London network operates. So to service your borough, to make sure we can treat the water and transport it, there's investment outside of the borough. At the moment, there's a £200 million project just to upgrade wastewater treatment in Newham, which takes the flow from here.
And just a couple of the points on the previous owners. Yes, we're not, again, I can't sit here and defend the actions of previous owners. I have to repeat myself. I'm not going to. What we're dealing with is our current owners, who have put 500 million in last year. We talked for another 750 million this year. They personally, and you can see who they are. They're on our website. They haven't themselves taken a dividend since 2017 and don't intend to for the next AMP. Within that, that's the business period, and they all also committing to expecting to put a further £2.5 billion in themselves, because they recognise that some of the burden of what the challenges that Thames Water faces, which is climate change and increasing challenges on that, a growing population, our ageing assets, all of which needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, some of that does have to fall on the bill payer. Our bills and how much we can raise is given to us by Ofwat, and bills have broadly stayed flat for about 25 years. more or less. They've only risen in inflationary terms. But yes, with those bill rises, there will also be significant support for those who are struggling to pay bills as well.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Councillor Melton, would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Michael, for making yourself available for questions this evening. Start with a process question. Can you take us through, given the forecasting we've already heard about, the increased frequency of adverse weather events, including large storms and flooding, can you take us through your process for forecasting those adverse weather events and how that relates to your investment program?
The whole process is written out and defined in a document called the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan. What it does is it understands the current performance of our sewer network and our wastewater treatment at a baseline position. That baseline position was 2020. It then forecasts how the flood risk and quality of the effluent we discharge back into the environment will change without any intervention up to 2050. It does it in 3 time intervals. So you do 2020, 2025, 2035 and 2050, and you use that as your prediction of how climate change is going to affect the wastewater services. That prediction is not so much temperature dependent, because for wastewater we are not as concerned with temperature as we are with flow risk, but it does include for rainfall intensity and as well as annual duration. So we know that we expect, not so much in London, but southeast of England is expecting a 20% volumetric increase in rain, as well as the items that Francis mentioned earlier on in terms of the intensity increases. So we've modeled that all, we've predicted that. And then what the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan does is it looks at interventions to not only mitigate the risk that is going to occur over that time, but to improve the baseline position, the 2020 baseline position. And that's where the £1.7 billion for this area comes from. It's the proposed intervention required to make sure that we mitigate all the climate change risk, as well as improving the baseline position.
Thank you for such a comprehensive response, Graham. So if I've understood you correctly, and please correct me if I haven't, then that Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan prepared on a 2020 baseline did not forecast adverse weather event in 2021 or allocate funding to prevent or mitigate that.
The Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan is not a function to allocate funding. It's a tool to demonstrate how bad things could be if nothing gets done in the long term, and to therefore use that as an indication of why funding is required in the short term. That's the motivation behind it. It is still non-statutory, so it was done voluntarily by all the companies in England and Wales, and will become statutory as part of the Environment Act. Therefore, obviously processing that at the moment.
Thank you, Graham. So then, to clarify, what is the mechanism or system that is used to allocate funding based upon the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan?
The funding allocation, we can essentially only influence funding in the next 5-year cycle. So the funding allocation we've got from 2020 to 2025 was submitted in 2028, agreed in 2029, and we spend from 2020 to 2025. We repeat that process every time the process happens of what provides new guidance, new technical guidance. So the technical guidance came out 2021, and it specifies how they deal with it, what things we can apply for, what things we can't apply for. They fundamentally changed the rules around flood alleviation. We used to have to submit a dedicated case, and we want to do these properties, this benefit, this cost, and they would assess it on a case-by-case basis. We could still do that, but what they've done is they've said, we fund you as water companies to cover a large bulk of your services, running the operation, paying the staff, paying the electricity bill, those types of things. And they've included in that base allocation of funding almost all our flood money. So it's not as obvious, because it's not a defined unique document that we submit and say, please give us money to do this and we will do that with it. It's more written down in our base allocation of funding. The funding is being reviewed because it's a draft submission and will then go to a final.
Interesting. That's a helpful lesson in the regulatory system that shapes the water sector. Given the restrictions that you've highlighted and outlined for us, including the change in regulatory allocation of funding, can you give an opinion for us about whether you think the regulatory system is fit for purpose? And if not, how it could be improved?
I choose not to give an opinion on the regulatory system. We are the regulated organization, and it's probably inappropriate for me, therefore, to comment on how we are regulated. Similarly to if you drive down the road and you breach a traffic violation, you don't tell the traffic officer how you think he should prosecute you or not prosecute you. So I'm choosing not to give a comment on that. The regulatory framework is continually revised. Ofwat have it in customers' best interests, and their intention is to make sure that water companies across England and Wales are providing service to their customers, and they therefore flex it significantly every 5 years.
Given the number of times before this committee, you've highlighted that you have been unable to take investment or action due to the regulation. It is disappointing to hear that you have no assessment over those restrictions within your operations.
What I will do is, with respect, Janina Gray and myself, this is probably quite a question at quite senior level. What I will do, I'll take this away and I will get a formal response on the company's position on that, because, as I say, it's one that has potential implications on what we say. So and with our positions within the organisation, but we will get you a written response on that.
I would welcome that. Further question. You've mentioned green engineering a couple of different times during this discussion. Can you highlight or name an example within Hammersmith and Fulham, a project which is implementing green engineering?
We've done a few with Hammersmith and Fulham as part of the Countess Creek scheme. I want to say Mendora Road. Jessica, can you help me? White City, we partially funded some of the work which Hammersmith and Fulham delivered.
Yeah, so we've had, Jessica Bastelt,
Joyce.
the Healthy Streets Manager from Highways and Hammersmith and Fulham. So we've had 2 phases. We've done our own projects independently of Thames Water, but specifically with Thames Water, we've had 2 phases of Countess Creek's projects. That was based on flooding in the Countess Creek catchment. The first one, which Graham alluded to, is Mendora and Molina Road, which trialled different techniques such as rain gardens and permeable paving. And then in our second tranche, we did 6 roads in the borough. So Munster Road, Eddiscombe Road and Rostrevor in the south, and then Greenside, Godolphin and Wendell Road in the north of the borough. And they were permeable paving in parking bays with some rain gardens as well. And on top of that, recently this year, we also did a series of rain gardens and tree pit build outs in Milson and Masborough Road as well, which were part funded by Thames Water. But yeah, on top of that, we've also done our own sustainable drainage schemes in the borough.
That's extremely helpful, Jessica. Can you provide an assessment of the benefits of those projects? And if that's not possible this evening, can that be provided in writing?
So in terms of the benefit, we can talk about the protection levels of those projects.
Indeed.
So in terms of the Countess Creek projects, the second batch, so the 6 roads that were listed, they're designed to deal with rainfall up to a 1 in 100 year event. So we put it in terms of percentage, or 1% chance of happening that event in any year. In July 2021, that rainfall event was larger. So in that circumstance, it wouldn't have provided the protection required. But in terms of general protection throughout the year, that does provide a high protection. In terms of other schemes, it varies throughout the borough. So our flagship scheme, Bridget Joyce Square in the north of the borough, in the White City estate, that also provides protection up to a 1 in 100 year event as well.
Very helpful. Thank you, Jessica. Final question from me, Michael and Graham, or 2 questions really. Is any of your salary performance related?
Yes, mine is.
Can you tell us what the metrics are for that performance?
There is sorry, you want to say something about it? No. The metric system is related to our regulatory performance.
Mm-hmm.
So we publish our regulatory performance, and you mentioned that we were fined because we didn't meet the regulatory performance. We need to meet, there's a series of measures. Every measure is weighted differently. Part of that weighting is if we were to meet targets, we get a small percentage of our payment. And if we don't meet targets, obviously we don't get any payment. But it's a series of metrics. And so the metrics you fail, you get no contribution, where other metrics you do get a contribution.
So am I correct in understanding that some of those metrics would include preserving water quality in the Thames?
There's a pollution metric, the statutory metrics that Ofwat records. So there's a pollution metric, serious pollutions, there's a sewer flooding metric, there's a drinking water quality metric, there's 36 series of measures.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid I've run a bit late. I do apologise. The Jim has agreed to delay the SUDS and bring it to a following PAC. That's the drainage systems report, because I wanted to bring in the gallery and ask anyone if they'd like to ask a question before, because we're running tight on time. Apologies. Oh, Councillor Harcourt would like to come in first. Sorry,
Well, not
sorry, Miss Dell.
First, not
Sorry.
necessarily first, but if somebody's up, yeah, I just had a quick question, because as I recall, a few years ago, there were plans which were quite well developed for a Countess Creek, almost baby Thames Tideway tunnel, and with what was it? One of the entrance points was going to be that Olympia car park and so on. Obviously, it causes disruption to residents and so on, so that's another issue. But instead, Thames Water seemed to go down the route of fitting individual flips or non-return valves, which really only protect individual properties. And if you haven't got one, then you're the next door property, you get the backflow. So how effective has that been? And what was the rationale behind that? Or was it purely financial? Because obviously, you know, something like another wastewater tunnel would obviously have dealt with a much more of a problem, wouldn't it?
Well, I'll talk you through the scheme, but in a nutshell, no, in terms of the tunnel to the storm in 2021. But so yes, there was flooding, I believe, in 2007 from memory within the Countess Creek area, and so on the back of that, we were tasked with coming up with solutions to reduce flood risk in that area. And so I think early on suggestion was to build, as you say, the storm relief tunnel. Ofwat, we presented, Ofwat wanted more detailed plans because it was obviously going to be 125 million off the top of my head on to build, and they wanted kind of more convincing that if we're going to spend that level of money, what more proof of the impact it will have. In the meantime, we installed something in the region of, say, 1,000 flips, well again, and some of the SUD schemes that Jessica mentioned earlier on. And so they were installed initially in a temporary measure. Then there were flooding again in 2016, I believe, on the day of the Brexit vote. So we're kind of known as the Brexit storms. And what it found out was actually the level, it was a similar style level of storm, but the flooding was greatly reduced, and the flips had actually far bigger impact than we initially modelled. So the decision was taken that rather than spend a further 125 million pounds on building this tunnel, we'd go with the flips. Now, following on from the storms in 2021, I say we carried out this we commissioned an independent review which looked into how the impact of, had we built the storm relief tunnel, what would the impact have been? And the modelling suggested that there'd be the figure, I believe, was reducing flooding by 3%. Now, that's not 3% fewer properties, that's lowering of around 3%. So again, the impact of this tunnel would have been minimal at a quite considerable cost to bill payers.
It was calculated about 40 homes, and what we did when we installed the devices in 2010 is we made sure that we would not pass flooding on to adjacent properties. We did a fair amount of modelling, and that's one of the reasons why we built the schemes that Jessica referred to, was to make sure that by solving one problem, we do not create another problem at a neighbouring house or at the end of the street or anything like that.
Helen Dell, do you want to speak? There's a microphone in the middle there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Helen Dell. I am a resident of Hammersmith and Fulham. and resident in one of the areas which was very badly flooded in the Brackenbury area. I'm also the borough's climate change commissioner. I don't quite know where to start, but we haven't got much time. So I will stick to a few points. My main message to you is that I think Thames Water, your response to this flooding problem where we've had 600 properties out of your 2,000 in London happening in the borough is totally inadequate. I don't know quite how you're going to get from the 14 million that you've already spent to the 1.7 billion by 2050, which involves hundreds of millions per annum as we go on. So that's a general point. I don't believe that your emphasis on dealing with surface water flooding and the emphasis you're putting on the Thames Tideway project as a significant part of the solution to this for our borough is the right approach. I think you're totally ignoring the fact that we've got a Victorian sewage system that you manage, which is inadequate in its capacity. We know that the sewage in Hammersmith and Fulham comes down from Notting Hill, Holland Park, Shepherd's Bush and into Hammersmith. So that is way before it gets anywhere near the Thames Tideway project. And I think that is a major issue you have to address about improving capacity in the system. That leads me on to the point that in future planning applications and future developments, we've got more capacity issues to deal with there. And a specific question which other residents have raised on what mitigations do you intend to impose on those new developments, given that you were consulted by the planning authority in any major new development in the borough, and how can you ask the developers to enhance their capacity and deal with stormwater storage tanks and things like that. So that is the very, I'm sorry to be bleak, and I know it's an immense problem, but it is inadequate. You're not dealing, as Councillor James highlighted, with the future proofing of the system. You're dealing with immediate response to properties which have been flooded. So that's where we stand at the moment. It's pretty pathetic. Where we go from here, I think we have to work more closely together. And I think I would encourage you to engage very closely with the work that the council's doing on their adaptation strategy. And I would like to see you get directly involved in those consultations with interested parties and with residents in formulating that strategy. Because we are all in this together. We all have a responsibility to solve this. I'm afraid, you probably have the biggest weight on your shoulders in your efforts to solve it. But, we're seeing a very comprehensive approach from the council in how they're trying to tackle these things. And your presentation doesn't give me any confidence that we can feel as residents of this borough that there will be adequate, if not good, protection in future for the properties that we live in.
I've made some notes, so I hope I've briefly cover everything you mentioned. You're right, 14 million to 1.7 billion is an enormous jump, It's
unachievable.
We wrote a special addendum document to our drainage and wastewater management plan highlighting the challenge around that and what needs to change. That is a cultural, societal change that needs to happen. That is not something a water company will just enforce on society.
You were talking about your own investment of 14 million to 1.7 billion. That's about you, not about anybody else.
The investment identified in the drainage water management plan is not directly allocated to all water companies entirely.
So that 1.7 million isn't your Thames Water investment, it's somebody else's. But why are you quoting it as your figure then?
It's not somebody else's. It is a combination of investment that would be required for the solutions we propose to meet that target.
Okay, well, you need to have explained to us what the breakdown of that was. And
there wasn't a breakdown applied because in 2050, we don't know what national government is going to do in terms of funding. We don't know what local government funding is going to look like. It would be very naive of us to assume funding from third-party sources in such a long time period where there's so much uncertainty. The DWP documentation is absolutely clear that that is the requirement, that is the societal requirement to meet that level of target. But as you mentioned, it is correct. That change is significant, and there's a societal change required to achieve that level of increase. If you think of it across the whole of London, it's about £20 billion increase over 25 years. It is substantial, and we are clearly aware of that. In the early discussions, the GLA raised that, and that is why we wrote a special technical guidance document, not to explain it away because we can't, but to show the direction of travel, to show the intent, and to show how through collaboration we believe we can start working to achieve those values. So that's clearly recognized. I apologize if what I said today didn't convey that message initially. Okay. I fully agree with you on the Tideway Tunnel. The Tideway Tunnel is not here to solve flooding, and it's not going to do a lot. That is fundamentally true. It's going to help a little bit around the edge.
Yeah.
But you're right. We are here. We are too far away from the river for large parts of your borough to make a significant impact. And we're quite clear, and we accept that. Surface water flooding is not the responsibility of Thames Water only. That was raised just after this flooding at Prime Minister's questions. DEFRA made it absolutely clear that there's a significant role for lead local flood authorities to play within that. And that's published on Prime Minister questions and documentation. We have a large role to play, especially in boroughs like this, where you don't have rivers except for the tidal river, and it goes through our network, but we are not the only responsibility for surface water flood risk. It's a shared responsibility. Your comment on planning applications is very valid.
Could you just, before we go on to planning, just finish on the sewers? Because I made the point that the sewer system comes from Notting Hill to Holland Park to Shepherd's Bush to Hammersmith. That's an awful lot of sewer capacity that comes past our front doors or under our front doors.
And you're not the only borough.
Yeah.
There are many other boroughs
so isn't this
where flow passes underneath. The trunk network with the capacity of the Tideway Tunnel will make sure. So if you think about it from a sequential point of view, the Victorian sewer system was built. They realized they couldn't cope with every rainfall event. They said, we're not going to put flooding in homes in general. We're going to put it in the river, and they built the storm overflows. The Tideway Tunnel will pick up the majority of that flows to stop it going to the overflows. The reason we see so much residential flooding now is because we've changed land use patterns. We suddenly have a whole bunch of residential homes in basements that were never basements before. They'd never had connections.
No, we understand that,
so
but
that's the logic behind
that relates to the fact that the capacity of the existing system is inadequate. So in order to solve this problem of people's basements being flooded, you need to think about future proofing, and that is improving the capacity of the sewers. So
it's a source control option. If you look at the size and design of the strategic network across London, you will not make it bigger because you will grind London to a halt.
So just to kind of, as the point I mentioned earlier on, was the amount of rain that fell over those few hours was about, would have filled the entire
storm event. Could you just explain what that 2021, what's that classification was?
It was on the slide I shared, so it varies a lot. At peak, it was a 1 in 187 year event.
1 in 187.
But there were parts of the borough, this borough, that saw 1 in 4. It was very variable. Very, very variable. But so the highest number is about a 187. There were places obviously like no rain, but some of the areas of the borough had a 1 in 4.
What was the previous events in 2007, 2016?
2016, we don't have good data. There was lightning, and we used radar data, and the lightning knocks it out.
Right.
So we don't have comprehensive accurate data. Around about a 1 in 32, 33.
Right.
But remember, the mechanism was completely different because the spatial variation of the storm changed a lot. So we had a very, very different storm in 2007 than we had in 2026. What we did see that Hammersmith and Fulham suffered for really badly is that there's two large sewer networks, and they form a big cross. And one rainfall event was one, and one rainfall event was the other, and the properties in the middle suffered under both. And they're Hammersmith and Fulham properties.
And so the point I was going to make about the 2021 storm is the amount of water which fell would have filled the 26-kilometre Tideway Tunnel at 1.5 times over. So it's how far do you practically build sewers within Hammersmith? If we were to suddenly turn up and we want to build, we'd knock half the borough down to build that. And then you've also got to get the water into physically it's like emptying a bath. When you empty a bath, it just doesn't suddenly go in there. It's the same effect.
Yeah,
the
but
storms.
I understand these issues and I understand it's very complex. All this leads me to the conclusion is that there isn't a solution for this.
Well, there is, and that's what's been worked. We're not the only.
There is a solution. The solution is source control. It's green engineering, and through the work we've done in the drainage and wastewater management plan, we believe we can provide most of London to protection of 1 in 50. But the solution is source control. 1 in 50. 50. Yes.
But we're just for the record, we're not the only. This isn't a Thames Water scheme that we've come up. This brings us in line with. Sorry.
1 in 50 rainfall return period. So Jessica mentioned the probability of rainfall. So we say it's a 1 in 100, which is a 1% chance of a rainfall of that intensity happening in any year. And 1 in 50 is obviously a 2% chance of the rainfall of that intensity happening in a year. Because it's probability, you can have a 1 in 50 in 2 subsequent years because it's a probability. It's not, it happens every 50 years or happens every 100 years. The storm we experienced here in July 2021 was at a peak of 1 in 187. It was a very, very big storm.
Yeah, but just to 4. But sorry, can we, because I want him to answer the rest of my questions, if that's all right. Yeah, thank you. Keep going.
Population growth and new development. Because you're in the combined sewer system, new development is your friend. There is really strong planning policy in Hammersmith and Fulham. And so when you look at the total rain volume of water entering our sewer system, a new development will produce less water into our pipes than an old development does. An old development, you get a little bit of foul water and you get a huge amount of surface water because it's not stored. A new development, you get a bit more foul water than you got previously. And the planning policy restricts the surface water down to 5 litres per hectare. And the net effect is 0.
Okay.
So that means every development is helping out in the combined system, like in Hammersmith and Fulham, every development is helping our case.
I'm not quite sure that is right because, for example, many of these developments, new ones or existing ones, which involve a change of use and moving from, for example, offices to hotels. Well, you think of the discharge from bathrooms in hotels, times 180 hotel rooms or whatever every day, that's must be putting pressure on the capacity of your system.
The rainfall, the flow is instantaneous flow, not daily flow. We want to know how quickly we're getting it, not how much we're getting. We can take a lot of water slowly, we can take less water quickly. That's how pipe networks work. Even with the change of use, just to give you an analogy, if you misconnect a single conservatory into the sewer system, that is the same as 21 homes as foul flow. Just the conservatory. The surface water element is astronomical.
But that's not what I'm comparing. I'm comparing a change from
use
office to a hotel development or a residential development.
The surface water contribution is so much. The foul water is insignificant.
Sorry,
I think
we need to have a specific question, a specific answer, just for the interest of time.
There's been a lot of people asking questions about this, and I've been nominated to try and field a few of them. Could you come back to me on the point about adaptation and your willingness to collaborate with the council fully and wholeheartedly in a resident engagement exercise?
We are very supportive of it, but we need to work across London. This problem is not unique and not special.
You've had 600 out of 2,000 in this borough, of your 2,000 in London, 600 in this borough. We've got a big problem in this borough.
Yes, we fully recognise that.
And we'd like to see
the two boroughs with the two boroughs with a big problem are yourselves in Kensington, Chelsea.
Yeah, and what we'd like to see you is around the table, because as residents, we don't see you engaging and helping us solve these problems. We see you trying to firefight what's happened, but not thinking anything about the future.
And we are probably, you don't see us thinking about the future because we do that predominantly at the moment through the service.
But we need your expertise to help about the future. So that's why we'd like you around the table. I'm talking about around the table in this work that the council is doing.
We can have a chat with the council afterwards and understand how we can contribute. The important thing, my responsibility is to provide the service across the whole of London, all 33 London boroughs. These two areas are the most sensitive. We know that from the historical data, and the work that the surface water strategies should release to us is to understand Where across London is the most sensitive other than this area, because we know this area already. It could be that another part of London has never had the rainfall return period in kind of living memory, and therefore we don't know they're at risk when they actually are at risk. I doubt it, but let's understand that. And the second part of what the London strategy really needs to do is to understand where do boroughs need to collaborate with their neighbouring boroughs to solve problems, and where can they work by themselves. There are a bunch of boroughs in London that are insular. They just need to look after themselves, and it'll all be fine because they can, through their own adaptation strategy, through their own management, they can solve it. There's boroughs like yourselves that cannot just work in insular. You are very reliant on collaboration with Camden, with Westminster, with Kensington and Chelsea, and with us to make sure that we have a plan for the whole of that area that deals with it all, because Hammersmith and Fulham will never be able to solve this in isolation. It is a joint issue. And those are the two key elements we need to get out of the surface water strategy, because that will drive the debate across London to make sure we're focusing our attention on the right areas, and we're doing it in organizational structures that allow us to work together where water flows, not where administrative boundaries lie.
I'm going to ask Casey to come up, but while Casey is coming up, I would like to just add a comment to this, that it really is disingenuous of you to say that there's three parties, there's more than your party involved, you know, that the sewers are incapable of managing even the amount of flow that we've got at the moment in sewage and water. So you're saying, well, that's the problem. The surface water is the problem of the local borough. Well, actually, it's disingenuous to say that the sewers can't cope. So you have got to, no, I'm going to go back to what Helen said, that you have to work closely with the council, because the capacity of the sewers is underperforming. So the surface water drainage has to be increased. You can't put that on Hammersmith and Fulham. That has to be in collaboration as teamwork.
So just very quickly, we're not putting just on Hammersmith and Fulham, and I think Ian and Jess, we've met with them regularly, I've lost count lots of times on those, but it comes back to the surface water strategic group that was set up is precisely that. It's us at the table, it's the local authorities, it's the EA, it's everyone who has a flood management responsibility around the table. That is being done.
And
thank you.
We need to recognise that the legislation is fragmented. There's a bit of responsibility on landowners, there's a bit of responsibility on lead local flood authorities, there's a bit of responsibility to the water company, and without those organisations working together, we are not going to resolve the surface water flood risk.
Okay. Casey.
Forgive me if I struggle for coherence here. That's just because my head is slightly scrambled. The first half of this meeting was highly illuminating, and this second half is slightly terrifying. Can I start by asking first about policy aspiration and aspirational policy? Because so much, to a lot of answers about what do we do or what do you do next or what are your aims and targets, you seem to come back to DEFRA. Now, unless maybe I don't get DEFRA, but I think that DEFRA is sort of like the regulatory body, which in other words sets the bottom standard. But I'm looking for what are your aspirations? And it throws me when I get the 2050 to stop things like 2050 as not even aspiration, but this is a time when we're going to look at stopping sewage releases. In other words, this is a problem that my grandchildren, who I don't yet have, are going to look for solutions for.
It's a really good question.
Give me something to take home.
It's a really good question. We have published aspirations in a document called 2050 Vision. So Thames Water said what we aspire to do in the long term is in a document called our 2050 Vision, and that says we don't want spills in rivers at all. We want to stop homes from flooding. We don't want any homes to flood. And that's the aspirational element of it. The challenge water companies face is that the funding we have to spend on money is regulated. We're told how much income we get, and we're guided into how we spend that money to meet certain commitments. And if we don't meet those commitments, we get fined. So that's the reality of how it works. And so what we need to do is balance where we'd like to achieve, where our customers say they want to achieve, with how we can release funding and allocate work to make sure that we are driving towards those goals.
Okay.
There's a likely chance that they don't quite meet up at the end.
Can you tell us anything about the pathway
to achieve long-term visioning?
For the long term, and what the short term, sort of like the short term.
Casey, one question. Sorry.
Yeah. Pathway.
I'm going to try and answer this simply. This is the first time regulators have asked us about the pathway. Historically, they've said, tell us what you're going to spend in the next 5 years. Don't talk to us after this. What they've required this time is a document called a long-term delivery strategy. So tell us what you want to achieve in the next 5 years and how you're going to get to where you want to be in 2050. They have put some rules on it because they're regulators. So they've said there's 8 criteria. In each criteria, you need to have scenarios, certain things. It's not just everything, but they've been really clear that we need to show a pathway to get to a 2050 vision. Regulators have also been very clear that they do not want us to use customer money to accelerate that pathway. The example I'm going to give is carbon neutrality. You may not have been aware, but about 2 or 3 years ago, the water industry collectively said we'll be carbon neutral by 2030. Government has told us we will be carbon neutral by 2050, and they will only fund us to achieve their target by 2050 because that's the government standard. So there is a pathway document that explains the short term of it in terms of how we get from where we are today to where we need to be by 2050. We've got an aspirational document, which sometimes falls a little short. Definitely on storm overflows, it falls short. Government have said this is the limit of spills by 2050. We've said we'd like to be at 0. There's a route on how we get there. Government are very interested, Ofwat and DEFRA are very interested in the short-term element of that, recognizing there's a lot of uncertainty and things we need to resolve near the back, but to align aspiration and government targets.
Okay. I trust that means I'll be able to come back to you for the pathway then.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, can we make a note of that? One resident.
Thank you. I appreciate it's late. I'll be brief.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, it's Pete Knapp again, resident of the Edward Woods estate. Firstly, wet wipes is an enormous issue. I'm pleased to see that Thames Water supported proposals to ban them, and I'd like to see this continue with the so-called flushable wet wipes that don't break down before they become a burden in the sewers. But the issue of what to do with wet wipes after they're flushed is the responsibility of the water companies. So wet wipes generally reach our rivers through the sewage system. There's an island of wet wipes the size of 2 tennis courts in the Thames near Hammersmith Bridge. And I'd like to see Thames Water contribute to that cleanup. It was a wet wipe blockage that caused my flat to flood twice in 2021. Where I lost many personal belongings. To call this an unexpected or a 1 in 100-year event means that Thames Water is not aware of the increase in flood risk from climate change. I don't believe Thames Water was unaware of this. Thames Water needs to increase the capacity of their systems to reduce the use of storm overflows and improve the screening of the screening of waste to limit wet wipes getting into the environment. The £10 million investment is small compared to the 1.5 million income from the CEO year on year. The lack of preparation was due to a chronic lack of investment. Things need to change. Will Thames Water commit to increasing capacity and paying their CEOs less?
I really can't comment on the CEO one, but let's start with wet wipes. Wet wipes are a serious concern. The wet wipe activity and survey work that Thames 21 does out on the foreshore here in Hammersmith is partly funded by us. We're working with Thames 21, they're a local environment charity, to understand how that continues post the Thames Tideway Tunnel. Obviously, we'll use the discharges more frequently once the tunnel's operation, so there'll be less wet wipes, but there will still be some. And so we're just trying to collaborate with them on how we will arrange surveys, all the kind of work they have historically done, both to quantify it and to rectify it. In addition to that, we're installing a large amount of sewer depth monitors. We have about 10,000 at the moment installed, and we're proposing to do many more. They are meant to help us to understand where blockages occur before they cause a service failure. So we have these depth monitors, they're linked to an automated system. The alarm goes off and says, the level in the sewer is too high. We suspect there's a blockage. We can then proactively send somebody out before a home floods or before it causes a pollution incident. That's more common on small diameter pipes. There's not that many small diameter pipes in Hammersmith and Fulham, but we are continually increasing the coverage. So we will continue to work on wet wipes. We will continue our advertising campaigns that is specifically targeted to areas where we know. We will continue our implementation of monitors to make sure that we can, for some of the incidents, resolve them before they cause a service
And the
failure.
cleanup operation?
And the cleanup operations, I don't know the details of the discussions with M21. I know that they're underway, but I'm not close to that activity. But I know there are discussions underway. We are very aware of the impact of climate change, acutely aware of the impact of climate change. Our historic analysis says, or our most recent analysis is about 178,000 homes in London that do not have a risk of flooding today, that will have a risk of flooding in 2025. And we're doing some more work to refine that number down and understand it better where those are, but we are absolutely acute with awareness. The answer is not to make the pipes bigger. We need to be absolutely clear on that, both from a construction point of view, from a financing point of view, and if you make the pipes bigger, you've got to make the treatment works at the end bigger, and you've actually got to treat that flows, and there's huge complications with, we already have a works that treats its maximum flow for 48 hours once the tunnel is in operation. So there becomes practical restrictions to making the pipes bigger, and that is why we, through the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan, proposed the SUDS first approach. The answer is source control. Let's deal with the water before it gets into the pipe. Let's slow it down. Let's prevent some of it from getting there in the first place, and by doing that, we will mitigate the impact of flooding.
So just to quickly jump in, and by doing these measures to slow down water by SUDS, that involves greening. That if we do it on the scale that we need to, that addresses some of the problems that was raised in the earlier report on temperature, for example, and those. That's why it is. We're not ruling out capacity entirely, and if there are pinch points in the network, there are certain capacity things we're not ruling out.
Yes,
entirely.
There will be tactical locals where we have to make pipes bigger, but there is no way it will technically work just to put another whacking great big pipe in and send it to East London, and that's going to magically solve the problem. The last one is the tideway tunnel, and then you hit problems of being able to treat that flow, store that flow, make sure it doesn't stink, make sure you can look after it safely when it gets to the other end. But there will be tactical upgrades, certain locations where there's a little pinch point between 2 or 3 roads, and the right answer is to make those bit of pipes bigger.
So one final clarification for me. When I say the storm caught us by surprise, it was that particular one-off storm wasn't forecast. I believe there might have been a yellow weather warning, which we get dozens and dozens every year. It wasn't that we were expecting extreme weather. We are prepared as grounds, we are acutely aware of climate change. What I meant was just that particular storm of that severity wasn't forecast by any modelling.
You've got to expect it. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Now it's running late, so again, I'll apologise to Jim about the SUDS presentation, but if we can ask for that to come to a following PAC, that would be fantastic. I think we'll wrap up. Thank you very much for coming. I do think some things have really come to pass that in the conversation that you really have to work closely with the council on, but there has to be money behind this. The investment has to be bigger than £10 million, which over 2.5 years, is a drop in the ocean. We can't charge our bill payers any more in order to do that. So we have to work together to make to make it work so that the surface flooding has somewhere to go as well. So I think you were coming back on, what were we going to come back on? If you could report back to us, Ross, what was it?
There was the
regulators
and communications are the two things I've got.
Yeah.
If there's anything else, please drop me. You've got my email address. Please drop me.
And the comments around the activity specifically for Hammersmith and Fulham in terms of the project that's funded, the 70,
Yes, I think that's right. And I'd just like to sort of reiterate the comment that the resident, our lead on climate change, said, 600 out of 2,000 homes, that's 30%. So you've said a number of times, we're not the only borough, but we are a significant
portion. Yes, you are.
proportion of the damage, and we need, you need to.
We know that. We're
wait.
acutely aware that all indications show Hammersmith, Fulham, Kensington, Chelsea, a little bit of Camden, very small bit of Westminster. That is where, for the moment, the concentration of risk lies for London. We are acutely aware of that.
Yeah, and I think you also mentioned, Councillor James, the sewer into the river,
Sewage.
Yes, sewage. Sorry, sewage into the river. The regulations might say that 2050 is the target, but right now we're all sitting here today going, no, we don't want sewage going into our Thames in 2024, 25, 26, 27, and for the next 24, 26 years, So that has to, green engineering really has to step up to try and solve that issue. Right, thank you. I think we'll close the dates of the future meeting. We have a meeting on the 23rd of April, which will be open meeting again if everybody would like to come. And does anyone suggest any work that we should include in that meeting? We'll have a think. We'll post it. So thank you all for your patience. Thanks for coming tonight, and very good meeting. Take care.